My name is Dorothy Shelley. I'm a chaplain for Phoebe Ministries. I've been with Phoebe going on my 18th year this year. Prior to that, I had a first career of 24 years in nursing. My colleague and I, Naomi, invite you to simply sit and listen. We brought no technology. There's no PowerPoint. I urge you not to take notes unless you feel very compulsive. You may. But there's several handouts. There's 4 handouts which you will get at the end on your way out. So I invite you to listen. And I'm opening with the words of a poem by the spiritual writer Joyce Rupp. And those of you who know me are not surprised that I would open with a piece of poetry. But in this poem, she talks about our goodbyes in life, and they are many. The poem is called The Ache of Autumn, and she says, "The trees grow more restless, October wind weaves through them. They shake their arms in dismay as if to fight the coming cold and the grief of leaves going. Autumn air does a heart dance on the branches already barren. The misty air clings to golden leaves, making the trees bend even lower in autumn. It is a season to hold the trees close, to stand with them in their grieving. It's a time to open our inner being to the misty truths of our own life's goodbyes. Autumn comes, it always does. And goodbyes come, they always do. The trees struggle with the truth. And within our deepest being, we also do. And one more short poem. This one I have a hunch you are all familiar with. There's a time for giving birth, and there's a time for dying. There's a time for tears. There's a time for laughter. There's a time for mourning, and there's a time for dancing. I spoke those Old Testament Hebrew words of wisdom just yesterday at this time when I stood at the graveside with the gathered family in a pristine cemetery in Upper Bucks County. But every time I share those words with the family at a memorial service or a funeral, or every time I reread Joyce Rupp's poem, I am personally reminded of 3 things. The first being that this life is fragile. The second is that there are no guarantees for a troubled life. There's always some dying in our living. And the third is that change is inevitable. Joyce Rupp writes in the introduction to her book, "Goodbyes are as much a part of life as the changing seasons of the year. We all have experienced and continue to experience gain and loss, joy and sorrow, life and death, union and separation inside each and every one of us." She goes on and she writes in her introduction that the cycle begins at birth. The cycle begins at birth and continues when we broke loose of our mother's womb and had that first forward motion. The cycle continues through our life, the cycle of loss and grief. Who among us has not grieved and experienced that great deep heartache or a deep sadness, wanting the grief process, and I say process, to end? The gnawing ache deep down inside each and every one of us. Loss and separation is tough. We all have hurts, we all have injuries, and we all have scars from saying farewell. From that film this morning, 3 words resonated with me: courage, strength, and belief. Courage, strength, and belief. Judith Vorst, the writer in her bestseller, Necessary Losses, in that book, she chronicles the reality, the pain of our first losses. Life is a long series of leave-taking, she says. This movement that we all experience throughout life of presence and absence, presence and absence. And one of my favorite folk singers, Carly Simon, wrote and sang, "Nobody ever stays in one place anymore." Nobody ever stays in one place before. Kenneth Mitchell and Herbert Anderson, All Our Losses and All Our Griefs, Resources for Pastoral Care, came up with 6 major types of losses in life. And they say they are material losses. Loss of an object that has special value to us. They go on then and talk about a loss in a relationship as a result of moving, divorce, or a job change. The third is psychic loss. Loss of one's image, loss of one's dreams. And the fourth is a functional loss. Loss of muscular or neurological functions of our physical body, the loss of memory, the loss of sight, the loss of hearing with the aging process. And most of us in this room are caregivers, and we see this every day in those that depend on our care. And we may even see it within our own selves. Change from our own good health or that of a loved one. Another loss that Mitchell and Anderson talk about is the loss of a role. Unemployment, retirement, entering school at midlife, leaving a 24-year nursing career and going to seminary. Oh my gosh. My nursing colleagues thought, something must be wrong with her. What is she doing? They called us non-traditional students, and yeah, I see some head shaking. A change, a major change in one's life. Systemic loss, a loss within a community. Last Friday, the community where I do ministry, we had the death of one of our residents who was with us actually about a week and a half ago. She was with us 11 years. And last Friday morning, I was talking to her aide, Mary. And I said, "Mary, do you have a minute to come in my office? You got to help me. You got to help me come up with the right words to say tonight at the memorial service in front of her family and friends." Because she was with us more than 11 years. Mary and I looked at each other, and there was a time of silence. And fortunately, Mary spoke first when she said to me, "You know, it's just not the same. You know, it's just not the same." With all of life's changes, no matter what category we put them in or what type of change, it's just not the same after a loss. We're not the same, and we have been changed as a result. No one escapes it. Seems we can't avoid it. Change, loss, transition, grief happens. And we might ask ourselves, what is this thing called grief? If you would Google the word grief, but don't do it now, you would find such words as deep sorrow, sadness, a heartbreak, despair, resulting from a loss. And then it may go on to say, first of all, grief is normal. Grief is normal. Grief is a healthy response. It describes the emotions that we feel experiencing a loss in our lives. We grieve after any change, transition, or loss in our lives. And we have to remember that it's normal. It's very normal. Whether it be the death of a pet, change in a relationship, change, loss of friendship. I remember girlfriends I had when I was growing up in my formative years, Betty and Phyllis. I hope someday to reconnect with them. I don't know where they are just now. Change in a relationship, separation, divorce. Change in our own health, change in the health of a loved one. Just now I have more than one friend going through chemotherapy treatments. Grief in our own health, a change. Grief in as a result of a loved one's health. Loss of a job, change in financial security in our lives. Change in identity when we make a career move. Or maybe it's the kids going off to school. First time I put my daughter on the school bus, I thought I would never see her again. How is she going to come home on that big yellow bus? And then when they go off to college, it's change, change. Change in a way of life, maybe retirement, moving to a new location. We often take that for granted in our, I was going to say residence, in the place, those that we care for. The transitions that they have been through thus far in their lives, and then a transition of leaving maybe the old homestead to come live in the retirement community or the nursing home. In my own nursing home journey every day, the hardest words that I ever hear from the residents are, I want to go home. I want to go home. We miss and we long for home, wherever that may be for any one of us. The most painful ache of the aged, I call it, I want to go home. The emotional symptoms, as well as those physical symptoms of grief, I have a hunch we all know them. Anger, anxiety, blame, guilt, that gift that keeps on giving. Confusion, denial, fear, loneliness, irritability, numbness, sadness, shock, and you can all add more to the litany. The process of grief, and I stress the word process, requires patience. Requires patience. On our part as caregivers, on our part when we are grieving a loss, it takes patience. We need to love ourselves, take care of ourselves. Attitude, Jenna just spoke of. Being truthful to ourselves, we all grieve losses, changes, and transitions in our lives. We all have our own preconceived idea of what grief is for us as we experience life's losses. Joan Rivers says, can we talk? Can we talk? I'm going to have a time now. We're going to have a time now where you're going to have to get maybe a little closer to your neighbor because I want you to talk. I'd like you to spend the next 10 minutes, 5 minutes apiece. Find a buddy, maybe the person next to you or maybe the person in front of you. And I want you to share with that buddy a significant loss in your life that you grieved. And then how did you deal with it? And what got you through it? A significant loss in your life, and how did you deal with it? And what got you through? Find a partner. Or even share your loss or something that, or some way in which you dealt with your loss that you you're comfortable in sharing with the group. Naomi has a microphone and she'll come to you.
I shared with John that when my father passed away, my mother and I bound together, and that's how we got through it.
That's how you got through it. Thank you. Anyone else wishes to share? Naomi, next to you, there.
I don't need this school teacher list. I just said something to these two young women about the loss of somebody who's still here to dementia. Early onset Alzheimer's of a very brilliant woman.
Mm-hmm.
And to watch her disappear is just, it's providing a lesson in learning for me. But the hope is that there is an academic community that's coming together around her who I would have never gotten to know, nor would I have believed they could rise to the occasion of comfort and care and real action, faith in action. Say, you know, sure, I'll take her to the hairdresser. Sure, I'll take her out to the barn to see her horse. I'm not sure it's a good time to get a puppy, but, you know, maybe it's the best thing in the world. And so I'm hopeful that the community can gather around. And I think all of us are going to be helping each other to deal with this.
Yeah.
Community.
Thank you. The community, the compassion, the collegiality, the friendship is so important at this time. You know, someone else. That whole back section was back section there was very talkative. Chatty, thank you.
My great-grandmother had dementia, and my great-grandfather was diagnosed with lung cancer. And we had lost my great-grandfather during my great-grandmother's probably second or third stage of dementia. So having to explain to her and reliving the death of my great-grandfather over and over and over with her was very difficult, just because she relived it every 5 seconds like it was just happening. So that was very difficult.
Unfortunately, it's an all too familiar scenario that we hear of and experience. Thank you for sharing that.
I share that I needed some perspective, some way to deal with grief that didn't necessarily let go of the grief. Letting go of grief can represent, and to me sometimes it does represent perhaps more of a letting go of the person, and I needed to not do that. So what I came upon was that grief is like an ocean, and the depth does not change. It doesn't get any less deep, but the boat you have to cross it gets better. And I have experienced that some. Perhaps at first it was a raft and I was tossed to the waves and didn't have an oar. Then I got an oar. I don't know how much past that stage I am. But, you know, at least there's a way to negotiate it without saying that the grief actually diminishes.
Yeah.
And the process
It's a
doesn't
process.
necessarily have an end.
Naomi?
Good afternoon. I'm Naomi Kolb Dublonica, Assistant Chaplain at Phoebe Burks. And before that, I had a career in family medicine. And one of my favorite things that I do at Phoebe Burks is companion people through their times of loss and grief. I can't tell you how many times I think of what Dot talked about. I go into somebody's room and there are a few pictures on the wall, and there's a dresser there, and there's a nightstand, and maybe a few articles on a windowsill and on top of the dresser. And that's all the things they have left from all that they used to have, maybe in their 4-bedroom home and their 3-car garage or whatever it was. But then as I observe that, some of them have friends who come and go. Some of them have nobody. And to me, that's kind of the ultimate of loss. My part in this is to talk about grief work. I assume, as Dot said, that you've all been involved, you've all had grief, and many of you are working with other people who are grieving. And you know, the more significant the loss, the harder the grief. You know, I remember a girl in my college dorm who saw her first gray hair and shrieked. I heard her all the way down the other end of the hall. But the loss of your dark hair isn't nearly so serious as maybe the loss of your marriage. You know, they don't compare. But each one is a part of this whole process of loss and grieving. You'll have in the handout, you'll have a bibliography of some books we thought were good on this subject. One is 5 Things We Cannot Change by David Richo. And one comment he makes is, our very nature, like nature itself, is calibrated to deal with death rather than to deny it. Indeed, death will not be foreign to those who have spent their adult lives letting go. Grief, yes, embracing of tears, makes possible an acceptance of reality and its conditions, including an ending in death. Now, you know the classic stages of grief that people talk about. Shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. Well, and you also know that they don't all happen in everybody and in every situation, and sometimes not in that order. But some of that usually takes place in all of our grief work. And grief work is the work that helps us to go from pain and loss to peace and growth. And grieving our losses, I believe, becomes a habit in life. So that when the big losses come, we're not just totally devastated. And grief work assumes you're going to do something, not just forget about it. Shakespeare said, he who lacks time to mourn, lacks time to heal. Someone else said, time heals, but not without our help. Our goal is not getting back to the way things used to be before the loss. They will never be the same again. Grief works helps us to adjust to the new way of life. And we need to properly attend to our responses to our loss in order to grow from that loss. And I wrote down for this a few tips for grief work that seem to summarize some of what I've learned. First of all, we need to embrace our grief. It's okay to lament, to cry if it's necessary, but to hide out in the refuge of denial is not an effective response. And you can't let go of something you haven't owned or embraced. So we first have to own, embrace our grief. We have to be present to ourselves, tuned in to the fact. I met someone who had a major change in his life at least a year, more than a year ago, I believe. I met him the other day. He said, I finally realized I'm grieving. But it took a while for him to realize what was going on. The if only cries are only a waste of time. You know, instead of owning, I had a loss. I'm really hurting to say, if only it could have been, if only. We go nowhere with the if onlys. Learn to express the reality of your loss to yourself and to others. Of course, that's a big one. Express it verbally, expressing it on paper. You know, I keep brushing this. Expressing it journaling, maybe writing letters. I remember writing a letter to my mother long after she was gone. There were still some things I needed to tell her. Of course, the letter is still, I think, in some drawer somewhere. Joining a support group provides an excellent place to express. When I retired from medicine, it was about 2 years earlier than I had planned to retire due to some unexpected circumstances. So it was retirement, and it was a bit of a shock to me because I wasn't quite ready for it yet. I don't know if you ever get ready. But anyway, I went for a 3-day retreat just to be quiet. And I met my spiritual director there, and I've been meeting with her ever since, precious lady. But she said something to me then that was really, it was a rich gift. She said, I want you to sit and look at your hands and ponder, reflect on what those hands have done. And what a way to reflect on my career and my life work so far. Those hands that had held a trembling hand, that had comforted somebody, that had sutured up wounds, that had done some very painful things to people, you know, like burning the wart off their foot or something like that. Those hands that had done so many things. And it was a way, a tangible way of reflecting on my loss. It was very meaningful to me. And then after we've embraced our loss and expressed it, and we've begun to express it, we need to reach out to others for care and support as appropriate or as it works for us, and reach out to the right people. I had a friend during that time. Occasionally we'd go for a walk, with whom I would go for a walk, and I felt very clear expressing to her how I felt about my loss. And she said to me one day, and Naomi, remember, talk about this as long as you need to. And no one had ever said that to me before. Maybe I talked too much. But at any rate, I was aware of when I didn't need to talk about it anymore. I was at the bedside of a woman dying from brain cancer a while back. And I had been acquainted with a situation in her life early on which was extremely traumatic for her. And she needed to talk to somebody about it. And we talked together a few times. And one day she called her mother in British Columbia and said, Mom, I don't need to talk about that experience anymore. Her mother just shouted. That was shortly before she died. And interestingly enough for her, because she had done her grief work before she died, one of the last things she said to me was, I hope George, who was the name of the perpetrator in her grief situation, I hope George learned to know the love of Jesus before he died, because he could have never treated us the way he did had he known that love. And I thought, oh my goodness. Here she wasn't wishing for George to go to hell, but her prayer was for his forgiveness. I think only possible because she had done her grief work. Well, and on our grief and growth group at Phoebe, it's really good to see the residents share with one another. And occasionally they share pain because of inappropriate comments that are made to them. And one of the things I say to them is, you know, you need to be choosy in to whom you open up your hearts, about whom you open up your hearts to after grief, because some people just aren't going to understand. You know, the person who says, it's time to get moving on now, you know, you've grieved long enough. Not particularly helpful. Well, learning to let go of the old joys, satisfactions, relationships do open the way for new ones. It's that death-life cycle. As we let one experience go in whatever way we need to let it go and in whatever time frame, it does open up opportunity for new growth. You know, letting go of anger or bitterness then allows one to enjoy the pleasant memories and to be open to some new experiences in life. Letting go of solitude opens up the door then to becoming sociable and making new friends. Letting go of our old activities and rituals often opens up the opportunity to establish new ones. I was visiting a resident recently who's disabled with Parkinson's and had some other problems. And she was very discouraged, a bit emotional because of the way Parkinson's can affect your emotions as well. And she just cried and told me how, you know, things are not the same. You know, she lives in now 2 rooms, and she and her husband both a bit disabled, so everything is different. And then I came back to visit her about 3-4 weeks later, and she is smiling, and I said, wow, you look like something good has happened since I last saw you. She said, yes, I learned to accept. She said, and what she really meant is let go of some things. She said, the apartment just doesn't have to look the way it would if I were taking care of it. The things don't have to be placed the way I always thought they needed to be placed. It's okay the way they're done. And she genuinely had found happiness just with that simple thing of learning to let go of her way of doing things, because she was grieving that I can't get up and arrange things the way I'd like to arrange them, make meals the way I'd like to make them. So letting go opened the door to a new life for her. And you know, if our arms are full of burdens and cares and despair, fatalism, we can't reach out for support and friendship, you know? Reach out. Requires kind of an emptying. I'd like to read at this moment A Widow's Prayer, it's called, by Rose Savitsky. O Lord, I surrender my gloom. O Lord, I surrender the tomb. I've surrounded myself and shrouded myself in gloom. There is room in my heart for love. There is need in the world for love. Your love has remained with me, Lord, through it all. Let me give it away to the world. I offer you, Lord, my heart. So it's broken apart. That's right where we'll start. Just seal the cracks with your love. The next tip that I offer is reaching into your faith as you're able. You know, for most of us, faith relies on a power beyond us, a God who is fair, a life beyond our mortal life, a God who gives grace, and many times seeking the support of people who share your faith. Maybe a spiritual director can help to guide you. We laugh sometimes when I leave my spiritual director's place for. I told her it reminds me of going to the eye doctor. I get my glasses adjusted and I can see much more clearly after we've been together. You know, an effective prayer is not, God, don't make me go through this, but rather, God, help me grow through this. And many of us find in our faith our resources for growth. And Jesus said, Blessed are those who grieve. Have you pondered that? You're among the blessed when you're grieving. And when you can't pray words, you can just sit and wait with God in your grief, because that's also prayer. And the Psalms have prayers for every occasion, you may have noticed. Psalms of lament, psalms of joy, psalms of pondering, debate. But in this theme, there's many psalms of lament and grief. Anne Weems, you may have known her book, Psalms of Lament, wrote a whole series of psalms, not unlike the Psalms of David, which she wrote grieving her son's death. And that was one of the ways she helped to recover her life. So we embrace our grief. We express our grief. I think of it orally or writing or on the keyboard, one way or another. And then we reach out for help. And we let go. And then we take care of ourselves. As Dot said, we have to love ourselves. And be very present to ourselves to take care of ourselves. I didn't talk much. I think I basically skipped over the part of self-care, which I meant to spend a couple minutes on. Practicing self-care, eating nutritiously, getting rest and exercise. For some people, drinking coffee might help and energize them, but drinking coffee does a job for me. So part of my self-care has to be staying away from the coffee. Eating excessive comfort food doesn't do anybody any good, just get hungry for more. Using drugs and alcohol might make one feel good for the moment, but then you get even more depressed. So that does nothing for the depression. So those things which help us escape don't help. Isolation eventually becomes harmful. So in part of self-care for some people is just getting themselves up. At Phoebe, it might mean getting out to the dining room for their meal and not continuing to eat in their room. So self-care is so important. And then prayer or reaching into our faith resources. And then there will always be ups and downs in grief work. Someone said grief is like peeling an onion. Every time you take a layer off, there's a new set of tears. Sometimes that applies with the anniversaries. You think you're doing really well, and then comes along Thanksgiving. And it's not the way it was last year. Somebody's missing, or somebody's totally different this year than last. So one shouldn't be surprised when you think, I'm not crying so much anymore. I feel a little upbeat. The sky looks a little brighter. And then suddenly you feel, oh my goodness, am I going back there again to all that grief? Well, that sickly stuff is a normal part of the grief process. Or maybe something triggers. You think you're doing really well, and then something triggers your grief. And I often use the example of my sister who, when our mother died, she was a busy pastor and had to rush home to Vermont to take care of some problems in her parish. And then we all went our ways. And about 15 years later, when Marty was doing a service at the retirement community where she works, she got partway through the memorial service, and she suddenly choked up and couldn't go on. And she said, I thought, what is happening to me? And then she pulled herself together and finished the service. And later, she reflected, what happened? I've done so many funerals. I don't cry at the funerals. Except she said, I realized that woman was, I remembered her talking about this lady, also had Christmas cactuses like our mother. She said, that woman reminded me of my mother. And I think I suddenly felt the grief of losing my own mother at this service. And this is 15 years later, but it was kind of unresolved grief. So we needn't be surprised when those emotions pop up. It's probably tapping into something, unfinished business from some time. And for those of you who work with people who are grieving or have a lot of grief work to do, if you haven't used the Care Notes by Abbey Press, some of them are really, really good in passing out to people. A lot of people at Phoebe read them and recycle them back, and we can pass them on. I'd like to end by reading a poem by Rabbi Louis John Aaron. When will I be myself again? Some Tuesday, perhaps, in the late afternoon, sitting quietly with a cup of tea and cookie? Or Wednesday, same time or later? You will stir from a nap and see her. You will pick up the phone and call her. You will hear her voice, unexpected advice, and maybe argue, and you will not be frightened, and you will not be sad, and you will not be alone, not alone at all, and your tears will warm you, but not today, and not tomorrow, and not tomorrow's tomorrow, but someday. Some Tuesday, late in the afternoon, sitting quietly with a cup of tea and a cookie, and you will be yourself again.